Hi, this is my audience. It's my mom because I have COVID. Okay. In the 1920s, nobody, not even flappers, could ever imagine wearing something so short. I have on shorts, but I could not get it, show it. Especially when mid-calf was considered scandalous. To help you better understand what a flapper is, I'm going to define it for you. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a flapper can be defined as a young woman in the 1920s that dressed and behaved in an extremely modern way. Although that is the proper definition of the word flapper, Emily Spivak with Smithsonian Magazine states that the word flapper has many different meanings that has contributed to the naming of the famous word flapper that we know today, such as a young bird or wild duck that's flapping its wings as it's learning to fly, a prostitute or immoral woman, a wild, flighty young woman, and a woman who refused to fasten her galoshes and the unfastened buckles flapped as she walked. Before the 1920s, women typically had long hair and they still wore floor-length dresses that had high necklines with corsets. That was due to very strict Victorian attitudes. These attitudes typically reflected modesty and Christianity. Flappers were young women that spoke out and went against these traditional Victorian attitudes through their own attitudes and the way that they dressed. These young women were viewed as wild and disgraceful according to the way they acted and dressed and how they strived for sexual freedom. There were cultural, political, and technological factors that played a big part in the rise of flappers. Women's independence also had a lot to do with the rise of flappers because this led to them to stray away from the traditional Victorian mindset. Some things that led to the rise of flappers include women getting sent to work during World War I. In 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, granting women the right to vote. The prohibition and the growing number of speakeasies along with it, and the price of cars decreasing due to mass production, making them more attainable for everyone. Many women celebrated the age of the flapper as a female declaration of independence. Flappers were not only women against Victorian views, but also were women against the patriarchy. These women fought against societal norms that reflected a man-dominated world by dressing provocatively, having jobs, and possessing sexual freedom. Flappers dressed boldly and unconventionally. The typical flapper dress had lower necklines with bare shoulders or short sleeves, and they typically came mid-calf or just below the knee. These dresses typically had a straight or slim silhouette. The dresses would normally move a lot when dancing, and this often would attract the opposite sex. It was appealing to them. Around this time, women would get their hair cut very short, unlike the typical Victorian long hair. At this time, the bob was the most popular haircut. Women also began to think that corsets were very distasteful, and they traded them in for bras and lingerie instead. Flappers also typically favored high heels and heavy makeup. Although flappers were very much on the rise, they faced a lot of backlash from society. Many believed this newfound lifestyle to be obscene. Many of these women faced backlash from not only the government but society as a whole. A few examples of this backlash occurred when Utah attempted to pass legislation on the length of women's skirts, Virginia tried to ban any dress that revealed too much of a woman's throat, and Ohio tried to ban form-fitting outfits. This backlash also occurred when women would crowd beaches wearing swimsuits that were thought to be too risque. These women were often escorted off the beaches by police, and sometimes they would even be arrested. A mass movement was conducted by hostess Mrs. John B. Henderson in Washington, D.C. that was geared towards flappers due to their non-traditional fashion. The hostess was not alone in her distasteful assumptions due to other high societal figures agreeing with her, such as Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, Pastor Dr. John Roach Stratton, and women's rights activists like Charlotte Perkins Gillum and Lillian Symes. Although flappers were big during the 1920s, their rise eventually comes to an end. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed, putting an end to the Roaring Twenties and beginning the Great Depression. As the Roaring Twenties began to die, flappers and everything they stood for died with it, as a new era began. I hope you now have a better understanding of flappers. And here's my audience again.